Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Owen Mitchell's live event on cladding. I'm delighted to have been sent a list this morning that said we had 470 people signed up for this event. That's an awful lot of people from various different disciplines, and when I looked through the list, I could see that there were many people on there who will have a huge amount of expertise in specific areas of this cladding issue, and we'd like this event to be interactive. There is a chat function and your comments will be taken and fed back to us as we go through the event. So thank you for joining us. I can also see that there are a lot of people still logging in, so we will have a relatively leisurely 2 or 3 minute start, and then we're going to get straight into it. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by fellow panelists both from within and without Owen Mitchell. As I said, I'm Jeremy Raj, National Head of Residential Property, and the 2 partners joining me are also National Heads, although they haven't been given that billing on our slide. Claire Patrica-Riding is National Head of Planning and Environmental, and Mark Clinton is National Head of Construction, both heavily involved in various aspects of the cladding issue as well. Our external speakers, we have 3 of them. Simon Allison, leading barrister from Landmark Chambers, who have really made cladding a feature of their chambers, and Simon himself has been involved in numerous cases dealing with all aspects of cladding. With regard to Brendan's practice, Brendan's an architect of many years standing. He deals specifically with build to rent, i.e. tall buildings built to rent, and modern methods of construction. And Eivind Anderson is Head of Legal and Portfolio Services at Homeground Management Limited. Homeground has a huge portfolio of freehold properties that they manage, and that portfolio includes a number of high-rise blocks. So a lot of Eivind's day-to-day work has related to the cladding issue. So that's us. The cladding issue is probably, I've been involved with residential property for over 25 years. It's probably the most significant and most affecting issue in the residential world that I can remember. It's complex, and hopefully some of what we'll do today is to simplify some of that, but also to highlight that this isn't a simple issue with simple answers. Very often in the national press, things have been presented as black and white with a lot of finger pointing. So I'd quite like to start the event by getting some of that out of the way. It's easy to point fingers at different sectors and say all the blame is here. That doesn't mean there isn't blame in particular areas. So if I can be a little bit provocative, I'd like to start with Brendan. Brendan, building design is all about giving people in the residential sector good places to live, but above all, they have to be safe. If buildings aren't designed to be safe, then that's surely where the blame starts.
Well, I think that, I think the failures of Grenfell are a collective failure of our industry, and certainly architects need to take their responsibility in respect to how they contributed to that, because we certainly have let down the people that we have let down the people we are supposed to serve, and that is a tragedy, and that is something that we need to absorb as a profession, and we need to respond very, very positively to that. But I think that it's a complex business. Design has its challenges, and bringing a building together is an extremely complicated process. But I think going forward, architects need to really understand the full scope of their responsibility and attend to that. And we need to be very much clearer on what we are specifying and why we are specifying it, and then we need to mount a very robust defense of that logic and those designs so that it follows through the entire process through delivery, and that the people at the end of the process, the residents, the customers that we are here to serve, can trust and enjoy the product that we are creating. So I think the architects have some thinking to do, but I'm very confident that the profession will absorb the issues of Grenfell and respond very, very positively to this going forward.
Understood, and obviously we'll come back in a lot more detail to the role that architects play. So some admission there that there are problems and that the profession is dealing with those. Mark, from a construction point of view, a lot of the finger has been pointed at the construction industry, the people responsible for building high-rise buildings, for building buildings with cladding. What would you say to the accusation there?
Morning, everybody. Yeah, I think this is a really complex question, as you've outlined in your introductory remarks there, Jeremy. It brings in a lot of considerations. The culture in the construction industry, the way we deal with risk in the construction industry. There's been over recent years a real trend of just passing risk down the contractual chain rather than looking at who's best placed to manage risks. Design and build may have a role to play, but there's the whole regulatory thing behind it as well. Some people will have seen the evidence of Arconic yesterday at the tribunal, the inquiry I should say, and it's clear from that the problems with ACM cladding were not unknown around the world. If people weren't already aware of that, then it was clear from that. There were dozens of cases in the Middle East, in Australia, in France, where this cladding had shown itself to be dangerous. The certificate that was issued for the cladding on Grenfell gave a 0, and this was by the British Board of Admin, gave us whether they issued it for this cladding or not. The one that was used showed a 0 rating, which is the best rating for fire spread.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of really concerning stuff coming out of the inquiry, and as you've highlighted there, the construction industry is at the heart of a lot of the problems that we've got. So some blame to be attached, and a lot of work to be done there. Claire, if I can come to you next. One of the things that's been said over and over again, particularly in Parliament, is that there has been a massive regulatory failure. And a lot of that was pointed at building regulations and planning failure. Is that something you would agree with, you would defend, disagree with?
No, I think I would agree with it to an extent. The planning regime and the building regulation regime don't necessarily talk to each other as much as they used to do. I think that's just purely down to the scale of planning reform and what planning officers and building regulation officers need to undertake. Planning is all about aesthetics, so whether something looks good, that's the planning regime. Whether something's safe or not is the building regulation regime. So when we're dealing with cladding from a planning perspective, it's really not necessarily, or it hasn't really been built into the system, that whether it's safe or not, it's about whether it looks good. And
it's a really interesting point, that distinction between planning and building regulations, and you raised something with me when we were discussing this that I'd like to come back on, in terms of how facades and things have been dealt with under the planning regime, but clearly there is something to this question of regulatory failure, and that probably needs to be investigated and addressed fully if we're to move ahead properly with this. Now, Eivind, I think the biggest proportion of blame in the national press, whether correctly or incorrectly, has been pointed at the kind of the evil developers, freeholders, the building owners, Do you think that's justified?
Thanks, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone. No, I don't. In the role of a building owner, we're one of a number of entities who are sitting downstream of the construction and the regulatory framework, who are left holding the baby of the cladding and unsafe materials issue. And don't forget that building owner encompasses a number of different responsible entities. That can include residence management companies who have the obligations to look after their buildings, right to enfranchise companies, and landlords of all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's such an important point, and one that I think we're going to explore later in terms of the ownership of buildings and responsibilities, and I think your phrase of people that have been left holding the baby. I mean, obviously people have a huge amount of sympathy for the leaseholders that are caught up in this and have been left holding the baby, but in their desire to point the finger at who's at fault, often people are caught up that probably shouldn't be. Okay, so last but not least, Simon, I can't let you get away with having an accusation pointed at you. I mean, bottom line is that this is an issue that needs fixing, and it needs fixing quickly. We're close to 4 years on from Grenfell. Endless inquiries, lawyers making money out of this kind of thing. Surely that's part of the problem as well.
Well, Jeremy, I'm not sure I agree it's part of the problem. It's part of the solution to a great extent, and I'm sure we can all agree, things like the Grenfell inquiry and various other inquiries that have taken place already are absolutely essential, so that we learn some lessons from all this, and it being a judge-led inquiry where there's a proper investigation of all the evidence, that's essential, so we've got some public confidence in the outcome and the recommendations. But as for the rest of the litigation, sure, it's created a lot of litigation. It's created litigation landlord on tenant, as well as claims against all manner of third parties, the contractors and so on and so forth. But that's what happens when the government pits two parties against each other, neither of whom is responsible for what originally happened. I mean, that's the point Avin was making. The leaseholders didn't build these blocks, nor did, in the vast majority of cases, the current landlords. So I'm afraid the amount of litigation is going to increase.
Yeah, no, I take your point, and I think those of us within the industry just think it's unrealistic to expect that all of this can be sorted out quickly. I mean, that does link to the interesting political point as to whether the government should just have said, let's pay for all of this up front and then sort it out over time. So that's maybe an overly political point. Thanks everybody, and nice to see all of you and hear all of you before we really get stuck in. As you know, we thought it would be helpful just to do a few really quick fire questions, just to put a bit of context into things, and if I can remind you, if we can just keep those to very short answers. Can I start with Brendan again? Brendan, what's ACM cladding? Why is it dangerous? Just a really quick rundown on that.
ACM cladding is very simply a sort of a sandwich composite of materials, generally aluminium on the outside with a polyethylene strip in the middle. It's a cheaper version of, or less expensive version of cladding, and it's as we know now has been very widely used. The reason it's dangerous is that the polyethylene in the middle, and there's various materials that do go into the middle of this sandwich, is highly flammable and contributed significantly to the spread of fire and the intensification of fire in Grenfell. And even though there were perhaps other measures in place, fire stops and other things, which there were questions about whether they were put in to the correct quality, the spread of fire was within the panel itself, so bypassed some of the measures that were already there. So really, it's a very dangerous material because the flammable elements are not protected; they are completely exposed, and if they catch a light, well, we know what happens.
Horrific consequences.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, thank you for that one, Mark. I'm coming to you next. How much money has the government actually set aside, and what has it set it aside for?
Okay, so we're up to 5 billion is the headline number now. We had 600 for the ACM, then a billion was added for the BSF, and now there's another 3.4 or 3.5 as the government say. I'm not sure which is the right number. And that is for buildings that are 18 metres tall or higher, or 6 stories. There is also, of course, a somewhat controversial plan to introduce a financing scheme for buildings between 4 and 6 stories, which is 11 to 18 metres, where it's been said that leaseholders will have to pay them no more than £50 a month, but no detail available on how that might work.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Mark. One of our other quickfire questions, which I think, Brendan, you were ready to answer, was this significance of buildings being over or under 18 metres. Could we bring you back in on that?
So the 18-metre rule seems to have its origin in the length of ladders that the fire department was able to bring to scenes. And so in a sense, 6 stories, 18 meters, they could get access to the building and get people out. It was part of an evacuation strategy that set a height limit, and it's it really hasn't evolved an awful lot since then, certainly from what research I've seen. So above 18 meters, there was a need for greater protection and greater clarity and understanding about how the building will perform in fire conditions. But that seems to be the origin of that.
So it's kind of as basic as that, really.
It's as basic
as
that.
Not particularly scientific. Yeah. Okay, fine. Mark, this the idea that this is a quick fire question is probably wrong, but in terms of accessing what money the government has set aside, that's a complex procedure.
Yes, probably more complex than it should be, but yeah, it is.
Thank you. That's we're on quick fire. That's a short answer to a quick question. It is massively complex, isn't it? And we'll come back to that. Eyvind, let's come to you. What are waking watches? What's the significance of those?
Jeremy, in this context, a waking watch is a temporary safety measure for a building where fire safety issues have compromised the current fire strategy. So, for example, the normal strategy for occupants of a building in the case of fire is they stay put in their flats and wait for the fire brigade to arrive to deal with safety. Where there are fire safety issues, the evacuation strategy normally changes to simultaneous evacuation, i.e. everyone has to get out. And the waking watch system is that you have to put in place a number of trained members of staff, normally from an agency charged at an hourly rate, who are trained as fire marshals to patrol the relevant communal areas of the building according to a procedure drawn up by a fire safety consultant or by the fire brigade, sometimes for 24 hours a day, as a means of alert and evacuation assistance for residents should there be a fire. It's a very controversial measure. It's come under a lot of scrutiny recently simply because of the cost. For some buildings, it can amount to tens of thousands of pounds per week that would fall ordinarily through service charges. So in the long term, it's an unsustainable safety measure. Important point, for high-rise buildings, the costs of that measure are not included in the current government funding. So it's a big issue that's still unresolved from the point of view of many residential occupiers.
Absolutely, and there are a huge number of unresolved issues in this. Simon, you touched on this before. Different types of cases going to have to be sorted out. Is there any kind of general oversight to this, or is this just going to be an ad hoc thing where leaseholders try to take matters into their own hands, developers maybe are pushed into freeing up money? How do you see the litigation around this unfolding? Timescales for how long it's going to sort out, obviously a hugely difficult question for you to answer, but any sort of general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a sort of initial spurt of litigation in the initial sort of 12 to 18 months where people were sort of testing the waters, particularly with things like the waking watch costs, which obviously were quite controversial. And at that point, one would find quite a few developers would take a view and sort of put their hands in their pockets for individual schemes where there was a lot of negative press attention. Of course, now the full scale of the issue is known, then the developers are really hardening their position in some cases. And the same is true of people like warranty providers. So I think all the construction claims and the warranty claims are going to drag on, I'm afraid, for a number of years, but they will have to be pursued because that's a condition of the BSF funding. So if there's a good claim there, it has to be taken forward. And of course, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, because of the amount of time that's gone on, the claims can't be taken. As to the leaseholder litigation, well, a lot of that turns on what the government does with the funding, because to the greater extent that the government provides funding, the less of a dispute there's going to be as to service charge funding and whether costs were reasonably incurred. But undoubtedly, it's going to take a few years for this litigation to work through. As I understand it, up to 10 years for all the remediation to take place, because there's only so many contractors. So we're in it for the long haul, I think.
Sure. Okay, I'd like to thank you, Simon. I'd like to change the focus a little bit now. I mean, we've started out with some general points in these quick-fire questions. Brendan, moving forwards, you and I discussed the BIM standards and global uptake. Where does Britain sit in this? When and you mentioned in or Mark maybe mentioned earlier international incidences on this. In terms of, we pride ourselves on the international standards that we've given to the world, but where do we sit roughly in the pecking order internationally?
Well, Britain sits in a very, very good position, in a very strong position. The BIM standards which were developed in this country have been adopted really nationwide within here and are now influencing international BIM standards, and probably will play out very favourably for what Britain has contributed. But what this is really talking to, BIM standards are a tool. What this is talking to is the digitization of construction, right from the design side all the way through. And this is, our industry has a long way to go in this process. But what BIM is the stepping stone towards is what is a digital twin. And a digital twin is a sort of an advanced BIM model that captures the physical components of a building or of a product, whatever it may be, but can also it can map and manage and analyze the dynamics within that building. And
yeah.
What BIM offers is the ability to do that and really look at a predictive model rather than a reactive model.
So I'd like to explore that a little bit further, and I'm very grateful there's lots of people submitting questions, and this is significantly testing my ability to multitask. But if I can just refer to one of those, Brendan, fire safety aside, how do you see the long-term future for high-rise buildings with complex external cladding systems? There's a second part to that question, which we hopefully will get to. But what is the future now? Are we now in a position where we go, look, we've had Grenfell, we've got a horrible mess in remediating. How are we going with those buildings? I mean, you're involved in the build to rent sector. Is that just going to go ahead regardless?
Well, I don't think it. I mean, I think that if we look at individual typologies of tall buildings, we can analyze them and say, well, they're either good or bad. But if we look at a wider spectrum, and we look at urbanization, we look at efficient use of land, we look at the obligations under the Paris Agreement, net zero carbon, all of these things are relevant to how we design buildings and how we allow people to live. We are going to be an urbanized species in the main from here forward. One of the ways to deal with that is to build.
Brendan. One of the things that you flagged with me in one of our preparation conversations was this question of digital twins for buildings.
Yep.
Surely we need to up our game significantly to make use of technology that is already available. Could you just give us a brief rundown of
the short answer is that we already have the technology. It's not been implemented. So if we look at the aeronautical industry, they have been doing this for many years. They stress test their engines, their planes on all sorts of levels. That type, typically in the UK at the moment, we're looking at clash detection within our digital modeling. We need to look at emission detection, and we need to look at other dynamics within the building and start to analyze that digitally and then intervene digitally before it gets to site.
I find that fascinating, but obviously at the moment we've got a huge amount going on right now, as I can see from the questions as well, that people would like us to address. Mark, can I maybe come to you? The construction industry we touched on earlier has sort of painted itself into a bit of a corner with subcontractors, tendering, and questions about regulation. Could you maybe give an outline for people that aren't so familiar with the issues that we've got with warranties and subcontracting that have come to the fore through the Grenfell issue? Unmute, please.
For some time now, the majority of work on construction projects has been done by subcontractors. Main contractors are basically just organisers of the project. They don't do work themselves. So the issues with warranties, there's all sorts of warranties. There are product warranties, of course, and there are collateral warranties, which are the ones that the lawyers get interested in, because this is the thing that gives the building owner and the funders and so on the rights to go directly against the subcontractors, because otherwise they're going to be contractual route. So yes, they're very important, and I think we're going to find as all of this unravels that in a number of cases those warranties aren't in place or they've expired. The issue I was mentioning earlier really is this fragmentation of the construction industry, where risk is just passed along a contractual chain.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the point I was wanting to make. It is hugely fragmented, isn't it? And that brings me to Claire. Claire, we go back to this question of massive regulatory failure. Surely the privatisation of building control and those sorts of issues mean that we're not going to be able to get proper oversight of these things. Is that fair? Would you agree with that?
Yes, there needs to be a greater interplay between planning and building regulations, and these are the conversations that we're currently having within my part of the sector. As I said before, historically there was a lot of overlap. Building regulations used to be part of the planning process, and over time that has not been the case. So in respect of these issues, it's just highlighted the fact that when they're not necessarily having these discussions, and over the years we've acted for many clients, not necessarily for high-rise buildings, but where they said, oh, I didn't realise that I needed planning permission because I've got building regulation approval. And it's just trying to educate both developers, large or small, and also the sector, that there isn't necessarily much overlap between the two systems, and that building safety is not necessarily a key element at the moment of the planning regime. As I said before, planning is about aesthetics and about whether it is in accordance with the local plan. But we're having much greater discussions at the moment in terms of planning and about making safe spaces, creating safer communities, which brings really into the heart of.
So Claire, one of the things that I think frustrates people is that there are lots of smart people in the planning world and also the construction and other areas. Is there, do you think, the political will to do this? I mean, we've heard a lot about planning regime. A lot of it seems to be focused on allowing people to take over local assets, giving people the power to do things, but surely at the heart of that there needs to be political will to bring a really strict regime of ensuring safe buildings.
I think that there is now a political will to oversee some element of reform of the planning system, as we've seen last year with the planning white paper, the growth and renewal areas, and how buildings are going to obtain planning permission if they're in those zones. We've also seen recently a consultation on the conversion of Class E, so retail to resi, which is also going to bring into the heart of the planning and building safety regime, cladding, where we are dealing with large-scale residential conversions of already had buildings.
It's a really important point. I mean, I'd like to move on to the Building Safety Fund, but actually you flagged with me the fact that commercial buildings now will be much easier to convert into residential. We've got a lot of the high streets in lots of our towns that are looking at retail being converted into residential, and the problems that can come with that maybe aren't on the government's radar as much as they should be. But as I mentioned, we've got various questions coming in with regard to the Building Safety Fund. Mark, a little bit of a rundown of how we access that, and maybe then I can bring in Eivind straight after Mark to just see what the experience has been of somebody that has been trying to access the fund.
Yes, thank you, Jerry. There's a question there as to who should access it as well, I see. And the answer to that is the government calling the relevant entity. It's the party that has the right to do the work and to collect service charges. So it's not the leaseholders, it's the freeholder or the management company or the right to manage company who will be accessing the funding. And one has to register the building with the fund, and then there's a whole raft of paperwork which Eivind will know better than I do that needs to be completed, and an assessment done by the government of the building to decide whether it will be granted funding, and if so, for what, because of course the fund doesn't cover everything. There are some wall types, there are things like fire breaks that are not covered by the fund.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think if I can pass on to Eivind now, but then maybe from Eivind to Simon, because I think those sorts of questions are questions that, Simon, you've been asked to advise on. But Eivind, the reality of accessing the fund?
Well, not unexpectedly, our experience is that the government has made grand announcements, but at the time the announcements have been made, there hasn't really been the detail and the procedure in place to actually help those who need to implement the desired outcome, which is remediation. So Mark's made reference to the long drawn out process to access the funding, and that's absolutely right. We had to wait for that process to be outlined in some detail, and since our first experience of trying to access the ACM funds, we've seen government, or rather through its delivery partners, that its civil servants in the ministry, and for London buildings, the Greater London Authority and Homes England outside London, continually changing and tweaking the procedures and putting in place new questions, new hurdles, new barriers. So it has been a complex and expensive and a time-consuming process, and to us, unnecessarily so, when the ultimate goal is to fund costs that otherwise would fall to leaseholders. So it's also been something that we've been in continual dialogue with the government and its delivery partners about, as have a number of players across the residential property sector, including the Association of Residential Managing Agents and others, to try and make it a little bit less complicated and get remediation started through access to funding earlier. We're hopeful that the government is listening, although again the reaction has been somewhat slow to date.
Yeah, absolutely. Simon, if I could move on to you. Thoughts about what Eivind has just been discussing, and also I've seen, just to throw you a slight curveball, the impact of leasehold reform on the ability to progress the necessary remediation works. I'm happy to discuss that one with you as a property lawyer myself, but that's just caught my eye as a question that's just come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to say that I'm not having to deal with the day-to-day side of the BSF funding, because it's an absolute nightmare. But I have been looking at various issues to do with state aid and also recovery. And one important thing to, of course, bear in mind with the BSF funding, I think it's quite widely misunderstood, is this is funding that's provided to essentially leaseholders. It's a credit against leaseholders' bills. So you only qualify for the BSF funding if the costs that you would be incurring to replace the cladding would be passed on to leaseholders. So if you've got a lease that doesn't allow the cost passed on, the building will not qualify for BSF funding, albeit of course the leaseholders won't have to pay. But that doesn't help you if it's a building that's owned by an entity that has no assets. And that's the second thing that's commonly misunderstood, is people think, oh, a big tower plot, that must be worth a lot of money. It actually isn't, in the grand scheme of things, worth a lot of money. You know, a block that's got 100 flats in might have a value of £300,000–400,000, say, which is a fraction of the cost of the cladding. So for single entities and for RMCs where people have enfranchised, so on and so forth, raising funds is really difficult. Just touching very quickly on that, you know, the leasehold reform side of things, I think that's going to take far longer than is going to. Well, I don't see it making an impact, because we've got to do the remediation now. It's going to, you know, things like common hold and, you know, reforming RTM and everything else. Well, you know, fine.
You and I,
the
Simon,
idea
had
is
a really interesting conversation about how most leases are not drafted to allow landlords and others to do what they need to do, which is to get into properties and to say to people, we need a new system, whether it's a sprinkler system, whether it's an alarm system that's inside your flat, and we need to get paid for that. So in terms of lease drafting, I think the point you were making is that needs to really be transformed as well.
I think it does, and that's going to be an important issue if common hold does take off, as the government potentially suggests it will do. It's going to be really important that the common hold company has access into properties. And this goes back to what Avon was saying about the costs of waiting watch. It's a huge cost, and it's a cost that everyone would rather avoid, landlord and leaseholder alike. The problem is that the way to avoid waiting watch in most instances is to put a fire alarm in. But almost no residential lease actually gives the landlord the right to go into someone's flat and install equipment, let alone recover the cost of it. And I don't think it's really the cost issue, it's the getting in there. And most leaseholders are very practical. They want to avoid the cost, and they would, of course, let contractors in to install the fire alarm. But the fire and rescue service, in most instances, unless you can say we've covered 100% of flats, won't let you release the waiting watch. So it's a real frustration, and actually it's something the government could sort out by just statutorily providing a right to go into flats to do these sorts of works, and a right for landlords to recover it, which is of course something
when we were discussing it, I very much was in favour of that, and that's something that we're certainly looking at, because it's one of the key issues of our time, I think. And speaking of time, I'm just conscious that we had a lot that we wanted to cover, and thank you for all the questions. Hopefully some of our pre-prepared questions will touch on some of them, but we will also be following up with a report that will go out, and we will try and follow up on some of the individual questions. Clearly, some of those are submitted by people who've got very specific problems that relate to their situations. So I won't be touching on those, but we will try and answer them following on from this live event, either in our report or individually with people. So apologies, we've got so many questions flooding in, we can't deal with those all during the event. Mark, going back to remediation and rights of recourse, my understanding is that part of the issue is also that when people do the investigations after they've identified, say, an ACM problem, is that there are various other problems that come out which aren't covered by the funds. Is that fair? Yes,
that's absolutely right, and I think we'll see more of that as the projects progress and the buildings are opened up. It's the nature of a rectification project, that where you open a building up, you will find things you didn't expect, and some of them won't be funded.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that. And Claire, going back to the planning requirements for office to resi conversions, Is that something that you have already seen something of, or is it something that you're expecting in the future?
We've had quite a few queries, but not necessarily in relation to high-rise buildings. So we are expecting it. But obviously,
yeah.
if you're doing internal works only, you don't need to apply for planning permission. It's only when you're doing external works or you're removing cladding. If you're removing cladding and actually making it look exactly the same or very similar, there's an argument to say that you don't need planning permission for that either. So it's only if you're changing the external appearance of a building are you then required to submit a planning application for permission for those works. So we have this disconnect really in relation to the conversions of buildings and how we can maintain overall control of building safety.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons I was asking is that Grenfell was obviously utterly horrific, and the cladding issue is a huge problem that needs to be sorted out. But when we go back in history, there are other building safety issues that we've had to deal with, and it goes to the culture of how we deal with these things. For example, asbestos was a very widely used material for many years, and certainly at Irwin Mitchell with the personal injury practice that we have, we're acutely aware of that. Are there parallels? Are there lessons that can be learned?
Most definitely. With all these things, it's about learning the lessons from history. And I think that what we can usefully use from the cases that have come about from asbestos or the other, the contaminated land regime, where there is a scrutiny of the planning application, it goes really right back to first principles of planning and about whether we can have a much greater degree of scrutiny at the permission stage, whereas cladding is an issue it's usually delegated to the planning officer, and it's a pre-commencement condition. So the condition of the planning permission might say something like, prior to the commencement of development, the external appearance or the materials used for the external appearance of a building must be approved by the local planning authority. So you have this disconnect by the scrutiny of the planning committee and actually what's being dealt with at delegated authority by the planning officer.
It's a really interesting issue of whether things are joined up enough or not, and clearly they aren't. There was a question earlier that I noticed about whether the blame culture, but to that I would add the lack of continuity between different arms of government, local authority, the construction industry, etc., is what's really holding us back. Simon, there was another interesting one. Oh, it's just disappeared off my screen. Sorry, which had your name on it. Given the evidence emerging in respect to Arconic, Celotex and Kingspan, what is the panel view in relation to the possibility of a class action against these entities by building owners and leaseholders?
Good question. I don't know. I think it's too early to say at this point. The problem in many instances is that people are quite a long way down the line, so they're often not the first purchase of their properties, and the current landlords are not the first, are not the people who originally commissioned the work. So there's a big old gap between the manufacturers and the people who are now at the end of it. Mark, I don't know. I don't know if, from your perspective, whether you think that would be a runner. It strikes me it would be quite difficult. Someone might give it a go.
I think you're right, Simon. I'd agree with that. The problem is going to be, do the current players have a right of action against the original construction team? But if they do, I can see it as a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, this question of mixture of liabilities links into another question that I can see has been commented on quite a lot, and Avind, I think you mentioned it as well. The government's stance is that the building owner is responsible for remediation, but you know, we quite often look at the polluter pays principle. I think you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, the rhetoric from government around building owners from some time ago and continued, I think, for too long, and deflected away from trying to put the and I'm not going to say blame, but I'm going to say the solution, which is funding. Funding has always been the barrier that prevents progress in this area towards remediation. It's finding a solution via funding to pay for the cost of the works. Ultimately, we all want to avoid that burden, that cost falling to the residential leaseholders. We've worked with a number of responsible developers who came forward early in the process to offer voluntarily to remediate buildings where they had constructed them, and our clients subsequently acquired them. But the response from developers has been inconsistent, and as Simon mentioned earlier, their positions have hardened as time has gone on, and the extent of the problem across the industry has become apparent. But I'd like to highlight one difference. Since the government announced the additional funding in February and the developer levy as part of a wider funding solution for unsafe buildings in the non-high-rise category, it's interesting that prompted both Taylor Wimpey and Persimmon to come out and publicly set aside very large sums of money for remediation of buildings that they had built.
I mean, there's no doubt that fingers could be pointed at various subcontractors, at various producers and others, and clearly the industry is stepping up now to say we're certainly not saying that none of the blame is ours, but I think as Simon was talking about earlier, it's a very complex trail, isn't it? I mean, we've allowed this system to evolve, which has so many parts, and actually pointing the finger isn't necessarily the best thing, but at the heart of all of this is who pays and where does the funding come from. Brendan, when we were discussing that some time ago, you felt very strongly that the funds, the funding, and ESG questions were critical to how we move forward. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
I mean, I think it's, you know, essentially that talks to corporate reputation and damage that may be caused through a failure. A dynamic that I would absorb in the market is that the funding world to some extent is greening and becoming to some extent value led, but the market is certainly doing that as well. And the development world and the construction world where we find ourselves is trying to respond, and it takes time and it's complicated. So I think that at the end of the day, it's about taking control of the product that you're producing and having a relationship with the customer who's purchasing that from you. It's a consumer culture question, and I think Mark made the point very early on that there needs to be a culture change. Our customers are the people who buy and rent our apartments and houses, and they have got to be our primary focus. Successful businesses are built around, you know, happy customers, and I think that funders are increasingly, and we see this in the build-to-rent arena very clearly, they are concerned about reputational damage. They are concerned that they have a value alignment with their customers. So understanding the customer base and really pitching towards that and providing a product that they want and will value is part of their agenda increasingly. And I think build-to-rent is an area where we will see that played out quicker than perhaps in other areas of the residential sector.
Sure, I mean, clearly with build to rent, if you've got one building owner, it's pretty clear where liability sits and how funding is meant to work. Mark, just picking up on Brendan's point, do you sense a sea change in how funding is going to work and when those ESG questions and safety generally is going to translate into the funding of future building?
I'm not sure it will. I mean, culture, these things take a lot of moving, don't they? We're very well established in the way we do things. In terms of the culture in the building industry, for decades we've been trying to change it, and various initiatives have taken place. But I suspect not would be the answer.
Fair enough. I'm being hurried along by the people behind the scenes, quite rightly. We had a lot more that we could have covered, but we did also promise to deal with some of the pre-submitted questions. Mark, in relation to consultants and contractors and subcontractors designing and installing cladding in new developments, what are the changes in the PI market and the warranties that people will be prepared to give?
A lot of people on this call will be only too painfully aware of what's going on in the PI market, I think. It's a very hard market at the moment. So there are two things going on. One is that people are finding their premiums going through the roof, and people would have felt that. Law Society's Gazette reported this week that for lawyers, it's the hardest market in 20 years. I'm hearing the premiums going up 180%. Somebody told me this week, 300%. Somebody told me as well this week. So there's that going on, but there's also, specific to this problem, a withdrawal from the market of cover for fire safety issues, and that is a growing problem. PI policies are on a claims made basis, which means that the policy that responds is the policy in force when the claim is made, and they are annual. And I think we're going to find that even if consultants and contractors are insured today, when it comes to renewal, some of them won't be any longer, and it's a massive problem, which the government is aware of. I know from speaking, they're aware of it and they're looking at it, but at the moment it is a serious issue for the insurance of what's about to happen and these remediation schemes.
Yeah, absolutely. Speakers, if there are any of the questions that you'd particularly like to pick up, or any of your main questions that you just want to comment on, please let me know. But while you're thinking about that, there's a question, Simon, that may be right for you. Fire services have changed procedures to focus on protecting the stairs for people to self-evacuate. Is this going to be discriminatory against people that, for a range of reasons, cannot self-evacuate a building with fire safety issues?
Well, have they changed the focus? Stairs have always had to be protected, as I understand it, from all the hundreds of reports I've read. And procedures always have to be put in place for people who are going to find that difficult. So, not very helpful, but I don't quite understand the question. As I understand it, that there's no change there. Okay,
thank you. In terms of the Building Safety Fund, another question. Funds are allocated on a first come first served basis. Avin, that's maybe something that you're happy to comment on. Is this correct? Is that literally how it's going to work?
Well, that's the message that's being delivered in our discussions with the ministry and their delivery partners. But that was the message that was delivered when the ACM fund was announced. That message was then rolled into the Building Safety Fund. We've since seen the Waking Watch Relief Fund. I think the question also refers to the fact that everybody knows and recognises that 5 billion is unlikely to touch the sides of the total problem.
I mean, that's referred to in our question as well. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about a £15 billion figure. I mean, personally, I'm always suspicious when figures are that round. You kind of go, well, someone's just taking a bit of a stab. But from your sense of things, Avin, maybe Mark, you want to come in. Is the government throwing a third of the money that is needed at this problem, or is that out of kilter?
Well, I'll come back, Jeremy. I think the government, as I said before, has a bit of a track record of making grand announcements without a lot of detail to underpin them, and I think that round figure is probably part of that strategy. It isn't tied or assessed on any real conditions.
Yeah, and equally the reality of accessing the fund is really tricky. We've had a lot of questions from leaseholders, understandably, who in many cases are trapped in really horrific circumstances. We can't solve those problems, but the question of whether they should pay, should they, if we can touch on that briefly, Simon, would you like to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I know all of us appreciate the real difficult position leaseholders are finding themselves in, and not just leaseholders who've just got their own flat, but also leaseholders where they've also got a share of their building. And I think that's, you know, the big message I think at this point is sit tight. I saw one question from someone saying, what can I do? Can I just sort of hand my flat back? To which the answer is no, you can't. You can't sort of forfeit your own lease. But ultimately, I think we're all hoping that the government funding is going to get there. It might not get there for everything, but get there to the extent that for a majority of leaseholders, the bills that are left are at least affordable. There are always ways of funding these things, for example, via lenders who want to protect their interest. I know that's not ultimately you've got to pay, but in terms of losing your flats, that's a potential solution. And we've all got to keep the pressure up on the government to get the funding in. But just saying, and I understand why leaseholders say it, the building owners need to do the right thing. That's the message the government was putting out, but it's not a helpful message. Because, as I said earlier, building owners have limited interest, but also lots of buildings are owned not by big pension funds and private equity firms and everything else. They're owned by the residents. And then they haven't got any commercial income. They haven't got a way of funding it. So just saying the building owner, that's not right. And we haven't really got into the detail of what a building owner is, but that's a complicated question in itself as well.
Quick comment on that, Adrian. Thank you, Simon.
No, that's absolutely right. We're also to stress that the solution to finding funding is not. There isn't one single solution. Ideally, if the government funding had covered all the bases, then the remediation process would be more simple and less traumatic for everyone. But in the background, I know we and many other building owners are exploring a number of different avenues to try and cover the costs of these remediation issues and the fire safety issues that are not currently captured by the funds. We're all committed, if at all possible, to try and avoid the costs falling to leaseholders, but there is no one-size-fits-all solution available at the moment.
Sure, and that's the sad reality of this. Brendan, a final comment from you, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulation and enforcement is really an important piece here. I've done work abroad, and they have different, much more rigorous. Certainly in Ireland, have a more rigorous regime. But I think we need to be able to trust the information that's provided to us to be able to that's provided through the testing houses that we can rely on that information. So all of these things need to come together to be able to provide an adequate and an appropriate solution. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. We really do have to take each case on its own, but we need to be able to trust and work confidently from the information that's provided to us as we move forward.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. Thank you to all of the panelists on this. It's been something of a whistle-stop tour. Apologies to people whose questions we weren't able to get to, but as I say, we will be following up with a podcast in a couple of weeks. There's going to be a report to follow, and we will be following up probably with other events. There is a feedback function which I've been asked to highlight as well. And apart from that, we don't want to go over, but we hope we found that informative and that it's given you some idea of the complexities and the way that things are tied up together. and maybe not as consistent as they should be through the industry. Thank you for joining us today. I think details of the feedback and the future podcasts and Erwin Mitchell events are up on the screen. Enjoy the rest of your days, everybody. Thank you.